Before we talk about the summer of 1787 and the Constitutional Convention, I think it's important to start with the failure of the Articles of Confederation, which were basically just a compact between the states. The states were still, separate entities, basically. It wasn't a charter of government. So, can you just explain to me the state of the colonies during that period between the end of the Revolution and the Constitutional Convention, that 4-year period?
Sure, it was a somewhat chaotic period. Uh, we can overstate how much impact government had on daily lives in the 18th century, but the fact is, um, we had no real central government, and that was on purpose. They had seen a central government that was strong, that was Great Britain, and they didn't care for it. So they wanted a weak central government, and that's what they built. Uh, but it had consequences, and unfortunate ones. Uh, there was there were things the states needed to coordinate that they didn't do very well. They needed to figure out currency, and they didn't share a currency. So some states printed their own. A lot of people used foreign currency. It was sort of humiliating that the most reliable currency was the British pound, even though we just spent 8 years getting free of the British. Um, Taxing for imports was inconsistent and sometimes uh, spiteful between the states. They something, and I think it's specifically Massachusetts put a heavier tax on Connecticut goods than they did on British goods, uh, and there was just real weakness. Uh, there were rights you would expect a nation to have that Americans didn't enjoy. You got the Mississippi River that was essential for trade for people out west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And to get to market, they needed to ship their goods down that river, and Spain wouldn't let us do it. Uh, the British still occupied forts in what was then the Northwest area, really our Midwest now. And they were stirring up trouble with the Indian tribes and sort of supporting their disruption of American settlements. Uh, so there was a lot to be dissatisfied about. And the thing we tend to lose track of, and I would emphasize, is the economy was terrible. We'd come through this awful war. You know, the war had been fought in our country, which is always a bad idea. And we had suffered great uh, damage, destruction, physical destruction, not just our people. A lot of rich people who were the loyalists left, and they took their money with them, which was bad. And then we had a lot of unemployment. Uh, it has been called the worst depression in American history, worse than the depression of the 1930s. So things were not good. And, the folks, there was a year or two of euphoria after the end of the war. And at that point, uh, I think people started asking the questions, what are we doing here? This is not what we were trying to do.
That's an interesting point that you make that I've never really thought of or heard anyone else make is about the loyalists, because the loyalists tended to be on the richer side of things. And when they left, they took a lot of the money. I know one of the huge problems that the colonies were dealing with was the debt from the war. And obviously, each state has their own currency. So you have all sorts of issues there. But that's an interesting point. You used it a perfect word, I think, for the situation, which was spiteful. These states were all kind of bickering with each other and spiting each other with taxes and all sorts of border and land disputes. But you also made the point that it wasn't just in the colonies. You had international problems as well, with Spain closing off the Mississippi, with the British occupying forts. It seems that no international powers were necessarily recognizing the United States legitimacy on the world stage yet.
That's basically true. You know, the French had helped us tremendously during the war, and they did recognize us. Um, but that was just to get back at the British. It wasn't because they particularly liked us. And you know, it was uh, we were weak, and you know, the world noticed.
Yeah, and this all sort of came to a boiling point with Shays Rebellion. And to quote the book, 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, and not even 4 years after a victorious peace with the British, Americans were slaughtering each other on the field of battle, neighbors warring with neighbors, incontestable proof of political failure, which paints a very clear picture of the situation. So, what exactly was Shays Rebellion? What led to it? How was this the boiling point?
It was the outgrowth of what would pass for responsible government policies in Massachusetts. As you mentioned, each all the states had big debts coming out of the war, um, and a lot of them made no real effort to repay them. But Massachusetts did. Sort of hard-nosed Puritan business types, and they were very aggressive, and they ended up pursuing collection actions against regular people. They took people's homes, they took people's businesses, their tools, their livestock, um, and impoverished people. And that was highly resented. Um, and, you know, there were similar episodes around New England, to be sure, and even in other states. But, you know, Massachusetts started the revolution. You know, there are people who can be somewhat ill-tempered, and they were then. Um, and so, some several thousand farmers and tradesmen, very common people. We don't even know what Daniel Shays looked like. He was the supposed leader. Um, Marched on the arsenal in Springfield to seize the weapons that had been stashed there after the war. Uh, and it was a rebellion. What their aims are, they had no manifesto. We don't exactly know. We suspect they meant to turn back to Boston and challenge the government there that was inflicting this tax policy. But you know, the rebellion was pretty readily suppressed, but it sent a real shockwave through at least the leadership class that you know that we're messing this up. Um, this is not what we bargained for, and we need to rethink.
Yeah, it seems that the Massachusetts folk are quite passionate and usually the instigators of some sort of change. And it seems they lit a fire under, as you say, the leadership class to do something about this.